I remember lying awake in bed, a 4-year-old, staring at the front door. My baby sister was crying in my parents' bedroom, and I heard a loud knock and a bang, some shouts all within 1 minute, and the front door was kicked down. And some men, they walked in and they kidnapped my dad. My parents' belongings were looked through, their clothes, everything, devices taken. On that day, our front door, we had no front door for 6 hours until someone had to come and fix it after that. My mother, whose family had abandoned her, became a single mother of 2 children. As time carried on, we went on to prison visits, and some were really far away. It would take us maybe 3 hours to drive. That doesn't include traffic. And if we were late, they wouldn't let us see my dad. We had to go back home again. My father, he would call us on from the prison phone, and he'd only get a short time to call us, and at a certain time. And sometimes we'd be on the train, we'd miss the call. He would send us letters and a few CDs. Me and my sister, we got excited with the CDs. It was him reading a story of God, Luck and the 3 Bears. We'd listen to it once, and then we won't listen to it again after that, because it would just make us cry, because he'd say our names and that was it. I remember I was at my friend's house. I heard her mum on the phone, and I heard her say my father's name and the word home, and I just got really excited because I thought she said my dad was coming back. And I couldn't wait to go home that day. I waited and waited, but no one came through the door. And then I asked her about it, and she said there was another man with my dad's name. Auntie just said that to not make me sad. After that, many weeks later, my mum said that we're going to have a surprise through the door. And obviously, us being kids, we thought maybe it was a new Strawberry Shortcake doll or the My Little Pony that we've been wanting for a long time. And then we had a knock at the door. She opened it, and there was a man standing there. I did not recognise him at the doorway. And then she said, "Look who it is." And then me and my sister, we jumped on top of him and said, "Daddy." I've still got the picture somewhere in my photo album of us jumping on top of him on the sofa. About 1 week later, my mum was getting the shopping bags ready to go to Asda, and there was a knock on the door, and my mum opened it, and a man came in saying my father was under arrest. And this is a week after he'd come back, 8 days, and just like that he was gone again. This time in the prison, it was way too far for any of us to visit. Even my mum said she wouldn't go because he was home for a week. He couldn't have done anything. And then someone said another person in another prison found out he was home, basically passed salam to my father from prison, and that resulted in him going back into prison, being recalled. A year of struggles, and he was finally home again. His licence conditions were eventually over, and my grandfather said my mum could come home again. Months after that, my parents were on the bed, and they said they had an early Eid present for us. I was 9 years old and my sister was 7, and they said that we were both going to become big sisters, and we couldn't contain our excitement. 7 months after my brother was born, he was visually impaired, and that he also had learning difficulties. 3 months after that, there was a bang at the door. This time my personal belongings were looked through, and my dad was taken again. He was back the next day, but he was sent with a warning. And then 2 years after that, my personal undergarments were looked through again by men. My father was sitting on the sofa handcuffed, and he went to the police station. He was home again, but he wasn't allowed to speak to his closest friends. He had bail conditions, and then he kept getting called in again to the police station to see whether he'd been charged or not. We got the call saying he had no further action. 9 months after that, we moved house. I remember thinking that it's a new house, it's a fresh start. The ED on the Britain First, they can't find us. 5 days before the anniversary of us being in our new house, so we hadn't even been in the house a year, at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a bang. They were at the door again. I got up out of bed, half asleep. I threw my hijab on, it was just behind the door. I threw my hijab on and came out the bedroom like that, my hands out, ready to be searched. This time they were like, "We don't like you, we can't arrest you, but you're British citizen, so we can't deport you." So he came in my bedroom, he gave a kiss to my brother who was asleep on the forehead. And it made me cry as I watched it, and my dad was out the door. I asked the police female officer could look through my things. I mean, I was quite old then. I wanted a lady looking through my things. I didn't want a man looking through my things. They said, okay, and they body searched me again. I came home later, and a man had been through my things. I specifically asked them not to, and they did it anyway. I woke up the next morning, just staring at the door, just sad, feeling sad. And then my mum came in and held me tight. My father had been taken to a house that might as well have been a prison. So essentially it was house arrest without it being in our own house. It was 200 miles away. My father, he wasn't allowed to use the internet, speak to over 20 people, go to the station and have no more than £70 in cash. And that's just some of the restrictions that he had. And he couldn't have £70 and 1 pence, otherwise he would go into prison for 5 years. And that's how hard it was. We had to make sure that he had whenever we went to visit, we had to make sure that our purses still had the same amount of money as when we left, as when we came, so that not a single penny was left on the floor. And when my grandma went to visit, with my uncle, my cousins, everybody, when they went to visit, they had to give their ID. Anyone over the age of 10. We visited him after Eid. Remember, the raid was in Ramadan, and so we had to wait till Eid, and then we went and saw him for the first time. We travelled by train 3 hours, and one time we were stuck on the train for an extra 2.5 hours because there was a storm. So we were wanting to see my father, and my brother is on the train with us, and obviously he's got his learning difficulties, so he didn't understand what was going on, and so we were just stuck there stationary for a very long time on the train. The house that my father was taken to, it was not made for families, and there was a massive hole, so it was really, really dangerous. And so my brother, he trips over really easy, so several times he nearly fell in. And this is the house that the Home Office had given my dad under his house arrest conditions, away from home. The basement room, it was too cold to sleep in, so no one ever even went in there. And the living room, it was a box room. And to get to the main rooms, you had to go up these really, really steep stairs. And these steep stairs, my brother couldn't climb up them. We had to carry him up there. And the toilet was right at the top of the stairs. And my brother, he would wet himself going up the stairs because he couldn't get to the toilet in time. A few trips after that, my dad found out that he had become a father again. Close to my sibling's birth, he was taken to an apartment 1.5 hours away from our home, but he still missed her birth by 20 minutes. After a few days, he was sent back to the location 200 miles away. When my sister was 15 months old, and 5 days after Eid, my father returned. He missed all of her milestones, her crawling, all of that. He wasn't able to see much of that. And then we had her akika 1 month and 8 days after he returned. And we had family gatherings, iftar with our friends, spent Eid together. And my baby brother was born, and we had his akika. And it was my parents' wedding anniversary. And then one day I was struggling to sleep, and I'd been up several times that night. I just couldn't go to sleep. Eventually, when I did fall asleep, they opened again. It was 6 a.m. I heard my mother say, "I can't believe you're doing this again." And then I thought in my head, what, again? And I jumped from the top bunk, threw my hijab on, and got ready to be searched again. And my father, at this point in time, he'd been home for 18 months. And they came in, they said, "You have 30 minutes to pack your bag." And they said, "We cannot tell you where we are taking you." And then my father was out the door again. Once again, my things were searched. I mentioned the years that he was taken, and this was like the 4th or 5th time that they'd come. How can they keep coming again? And then I started crying, and my mum came and helped me calm down. Alhamdulillah, we heard that my father, he wasn't taken so far as last time. Last time it was 200 miles. 4 hours by car, 3 hours by train. This time it was only 1.5 hours away. And how was I supposed to explain to my brother with learning difficulties that Daddy was taken again? We didn't know how we were going to do it. And then again, another sibling would have to grow up without my dad, have the milestones, and my dad would have to get to know him through a phone call. He was given a list of people he wasn't allowed to see, 70 or something like that. List of people were people he didn't even know, and if he bumped into them in the street, he wouldn't know. They would have arrested him properly and sent him to prison for 5 years, but he wasn't to know who they were. By this time, after this raid, I believe it's possibly the 5th raid, I just felt numb. I didn't know what to feel anymore. I just got on with life. I studied, did my work experience, went to my grandmother's house, went to the park, visited my friends and visited my dad. That was just my life. At some point in time, my mother said to me, the solicitor said there's a chance that my dad can come back early. By this time, I just felt panicked. I had finally gotten over him not being in the house, and then suddenly he would be back again. And I wasn't meant to prepare for that. I wasn't ready for him to come back. And then I hate myself for feeling that way. I hate myself for feeling that way. That I didn't want my dad to come back. Anyway, lockdown came, and we didn't know what the rules would be like, so we stayed with my father in his house arrest place for weeks on end, and finally we could go home, so we went home. But we went home without my dad. We went back to see him every week by cab because we couldn't manage the transport. It was a lot of work. Having my brother who struggles, he can walk, but he struggles after a long time. He gets tired too quickly, and then when he gets tired, he starts misbehaving and becoming unmanageable. So we couldn't handle that. So we had to book cab journeys. So from my house to where my dad was staying, it was £200 journey for a week. My baby brother, not even 2 at this time, he used to be really sad when we got into the cab, and my dad, he could give us kisses before we left, but he wasn't allowed to obviously get in the cab and go home. So he would come in, give us our hugs, and then he would come out again and have to go back into his house. And my baby brother, he used to be sad when my dad would leave. And then eventually he just stopped being sad. He was just used to it. We would be at home and then we'd go to Daddy's house for a few days. We'd be at home, we'd get in the cab, be at Daddy's house for a few days, get back in the cab, and then we'd go home. And the baby, he was just used to it. He didn't cry anymore. We weren't allowed our phones. We weren't able to call my family, my cousins, my grandma, all this. And my father, he could call them because he was the only one who was allowed the phone. But we couldn't talk to them through his phone. Again, if we were to speak through that phone to the people on the other side, my father would be arrested for 5 years in prison. We had to stay quiet when the phone was on, just in case our voices travelled and it sounded like we were talking to the people on the other side. At some point, my grandma, she went abroad, and my father, he wasn't allowed international calls, so he wasn't able to call her. We were in lockdown, so we couldn't leave the house, and we weren't allowed technology. I fell behind on my studies, but now, because I was studying from home, I have to upload my work, and I wasn't able to do that because we were with my dad. The weeks we would go to my dad's house, so I did fall behind on my studies then, and then I would just rush it. And then my deadline came. I think it was the last day, 2 days left, and then my entire course would have finished. And if I hadn't finished the course, then I'd have to pay an extension fee, and that was quite a lot of money. I just about managed to complete the course during the deadline. 6 months before my father was due back, there was a bang at the door. When there's a bang at the door, we knew what was going to happen. And I remember thinking to myself, it's not possible. Daddy's not even here. Why are they here? They came in, and this time they said my mother was under arrest. This time I stayed strong in the living room. She was in the bedroom having a panic attack because they were coming to take my mum. First thing I did was I called the solicitor, and he didn't pick up. Then I called my dad and told him that my mum's being arrested. And then after the solicitor had got off the phone, I called my dad and he didn't pick up. I called him again and again and again and again, and he still didn't pick up. Then I called the solicitor and they said my dad had been arrested as well. So at this moment in time, we're being raided. My mother's arrested and my father's arrested. And I was categorised as an adult at the time, so I was the carer for my siblings at this point. So my uncle came and I stayed strong through this point. I was strong. I didn't cry. They told me that they were going to take my mom soon, so they'd already arrested her. And then I asked them, "Will you bring her back today?" And they said yes. And then when they were taking my mom, they got me on camera and they asked me, do I consent to be a guardian for my siblings whilst they took my mother away, and I said yes. And one of the officers, he told me that when they got to the police station, that he'd allow my mum to call and say that she was okay, but she didn't call. And she didn't. We waited for the call and she didn't. And my uncle, he kept the officer's number and he tried calling him and he would just want to pick up. I placed a phone call, and that's when I broke into tears because I couldn't do the one thing my mother asked me to do when she left. She told me to call the phone company and tell them to send an emergency SIM because the hospital was going to call to book my brother's appointment. And I couldn't do that because I couldn't get through her password. She gave me the password, but they still wouldn't let me get through. And I started crying while I was on the phone, and the man on the other side, the call centre man, he was trying to calm me down and trying to console me, but I still didn't get the task done. My mum, she came back around 11 p.m. and she gave me a hug and was given bail pending investigation. And I think I heard the phone ring, and that's when I jumped out, and it was my dad saying, my dad on the phone. He was back at his house 2 hours after my mum, and then we were safe and sound. Many months later, after all the stress and wondering what's going to happen with this, when the news came that my parents had been released of charges from this specific raid, so my father wasn't free yet, but he was released of the charges for this recent raid, my mum, she went into sujood and started crying. And then the letter came with no stamp or anything saying that she was free of all charges, but still, it didn't look even official, so at the time I didn't believe the letter. I thought it was fake. Eventually my grandma, she returned home from her trip abroad. The lockdown, she had to isolate, so she hadn't spoken to my dad in 7 months. Our family, they came to my dad's house on Eid day. We all went into the garden and we all went on our phones and called my grandma while she was where she was, and my dad wasn't allowed to speak to her. His face wasn't allowed to be shown in a camera, and he couldn't respond to any of her messages, couldn't speak to her, couldn't listen to her. He just had to stay away. Otherwise, he would be arrested in prison for 5 years. On the day my dad returned, when they cut his tag, all the blood rushed to his ankle was like yellow because the blood has been restricted from it, and it all just rushed to the ankle. And even now when you look, there's a mark from where the tag had been. And at this moment in time, my father, he resided in captivity longer than he had been in our new house. So alhamdulillah, he's back now, but the trauma isn't over. I see police on the street, police cars near my house. My sister, she used to say that you've just got paranoia. But every time I would go to my sewing class, I'd always see a police car driving by. They're following us. Every bang at the door, and we think it's the police, but it's just the postman banging really loudly. And our hearts are racing, thinking, why do they bang so loudly? It just drives us insane. Every time my father doesn't pick up the phone, we think he's been arrested. Even the other day, I'm talking maybe last week, he said he would be 10 minutes. He was 10 minutes away from home. It had been half an hour and he wasn't home yet. And he wouldn't pick up his phone. We called so many times and he just wouldn't pick up. My mother was about to go and search for him when he called and said he was okay. He was just at the masjid. This is the life we have to live, having to keep tabs on a grown man just to keep our minds at rest. He can't get a job because businesses would be shut down if he were to work for them. And the new law now states that it won't be for a specific amount of time. It will be indefinitely. When we had nowhere to go, Hugs was there for us. They gave us, they held Eid parties for us, gave us Eid presents, and I still have some of them now. This one, the Eid presents from when I was very young. And when we would go to the Eid parties, we would see other Hugs families, and they're people like us. Until you realise that those adults that are there now are those children from all those years ago. Whose fathers are still in captivity or still struggling from the hardships. And Hugs are there to help them. Knowing that Hugs is there and there are other people like us and hearing other people's stories, it makes you just feel not so alone. So Hugs, they sent brothers to pick us up and drive us at 200 plus miles from our house to my dad's first house arrest location. And then the second location, we couldn't manage the car journeys. That journey used to cost us £200. So Hugs, they said they'll pay for the second trip. So we would visit him twice a month. Hugs paid for my sister's dyslexia test. Because we're homeschooled, we don't get things that schools get. We have to pay for it out of our own pocket. We had to go private to get this dyslexia test. My sister now, she does have dyslexia after all this time. We didn't know. When she was 15 years old, she got diagnosed with dyslexia. And so for 15 years, she'd been homeschooled, and my mum's trying to get her to listen, and she doesn't understand. Hugs have offered to pay for my sister's further education courses. Well, she hasn't started them yet, so they're still. And they've helped us with shopping vouchers to buy food and clothing, and even my mum, she said the other day she doesn't like taking the money from Hugs. She feels like she's taking other people's money, but it's money that we need because otherwise we don't have any food. The food prices have gone up and we need clothing. My brother's been without a coat for a long time. Mum finally was able to get a coat with the money that Hugs gave, and they gave us new bedding. My bedding had turned a different colour. It turned yellow from oldness, and then Hugs, they gave us new bedding. They have helped my family so much, and they help other families too. Families who their breadwinners have been taken away from them forcefully. I understand our poverty isn't the same as those in other countries, but Allah tests us all differently. He never burdens us all with more than we can bear. Hugs have helped us so much, and I just feel that how bad was it that in Ramadan, when charities were getting hundreds of thousands of pounds, and Hugs got practically nothing. We just felt saddened. You might say that, oh, we're in the UK, there is no such harshness as in the other countries. In the other countries there's physical harm, but in the UK the harm that we get is mentally and psychologically. Just as a reminder, Muhammad ﷺ said that charity never decreases wealth. He never specified we don't have to be in Lebanon and Yemen to need help, and that's what Hugs do. They help the people in the UK. Charity has never decreased your wealth, and it never will.